here will be David McNally. He's been active in the New Socialist Group and the Toronto Historical Materials Group, and he's the author of many books, including most recently Monsters of the Market, Zombies, Vampires, and Global Capitalism.
Well, I don't think I need to tell you that we're in the presence of and celebrating an outstanding achievement. I think everything you've just heard from John Riddell makes that obvious. We're talking about the recuperation of absolutely pivotal historical experiences and events for the revolutionary left today and the revolutionary lefts of the future. And without the enormous work that John has described, frankly, we would be considerably weaker and poorer in terms of our historical knowledge, our theoretical assessments, our access to crucial debates, documents, and so on. Now, I can't possibly offer you a summary of everything that's in here. You have to buy it, read it, discuss it, debate it. What I wanted to do was just to first share a few personal highlights and then turn to the question of the word that John actually uses in his title for the event today, translations, and talk about what that means, I think, politically for us. So to offer you some highlights, the discussion of the United Front is amazing for its complexity, its depth, the differences that come out, the sense in which you are part of a living movement that is trying to chart a new direction for dealing with the problem of workers' revolution at a moment where the revolutionary wave that had swept much of Europe was receding, and there was a much more complicated strategic and tactical terrain that needed to be negotiated. Utterly fascinating. For me, the intervention of a Tunisian delegate was just phenomenal. This was just refreshing to hear this communist worker from Tunisia get up and vitriolically attack the national chauvinism that was so present in the French Communist Party with respect to the struggle against imperialism and colonialism in Algeria and Tunisia. It just stood out for a sense of what it meant for this living movement to break out of the European core. John referred to the problem of Eurocentrism, but then how vital it was to actually develop a genuinely anti-colonial position. Clara Zetkin's speech on behalf of the International Women's Secretariat of the Communist International is incredibly interesting for the issues she raises. Women's newspapers put out by communist parties, the importance of International Women's Day, the struggle around abortion rights and against the criminalization of abortion. And then you can honestly, I think, feel the emotion, even though you're reading it on the text, when she announces to the delegates that revolutionary women in Turin have just, in the last few weeks, had a mass anti-fascist march. They were armed women with a banner simply saying Rosa Luxemburg. And it's really quite profound, the experience of reading through those moments. But probably more than anything else, in terms of really what all of this ought to mean for us, I was struck over and over again by the question of translation. And I think when John talks about translations for the 21st century, one of the things you're also seeing in and around this Congress is the problem of translation. That is to say, Lenin famously said at one point about the Comintern, our resolutions are too Russian. And you can see the movements in other countries struggling with whether they are simply going to try to mechanically and literally apply, which almost inevitably produces disasters, or whether they are going to learn the art of political translation into different circumstances, based upon different kinds of organization, different kinds of working class traditions, and so on. And of course, this, I would argue, is an absolutely fundamental question in the German case, so I very much look forward to what John is doing with respect to the Third Congress, because one of the things that we know is that around Paul Levy and Clara Zetkin, a leadership was being built in Germany, which was in a certain sense synthesizing all the best of the Rosa Luxemburg tradition with key aspects of the revolutionary experience in Russia. And it was a new synthesis, it wasn't a repetition. And of course, all real translation is about that. When you try to get literal, you produce disasters. Probably my favorite example from the history of far-left groups is a really interesting pamphlet from the 1970s, written in English, called Portugal at the Crossroads. Translated into Portuguese, it meant Portugal at the traffic lights. And that literalism was, in that case, a direct problem. But I think what we inherit, and what John was speaking to at the end, and what he means by, in a certain sense, offering us this text for the future, is that we have to become translators. People able to understand what is living and relevant, but also what it means to synthesize it and to make these texts living documents that speak to our era in changed circumstances, rather than simply become parrots trying to repeat it. And I think John has done this in that spirit, and that we should celebrate it and thank him.
Be followed by Greg Albo, who teaches political economy at York University. His recent books include this year's Socialist Register, recently launched, On the Question of Strategy, and Empire's Ally, Canada and the War in Afghanistan.
Let me begin by saying the same thing as David, that this is a remarkable accomplishment of scholarship and politics. The volume is just amazingly filled with ideas and debates that are fascinating, and it allows us to communicate not only through time but across so many languages and so forth. I was reminded, of course, of Walter Benjamin's famous article on translation in his Illuminations, where he writes, in the same way a translation, instead of resembling the meaning of the original, must lovingly, and he was in love, I think, at times with the commenter, and in detail incorporate the original's mode of signification, thus making both an original and the translation recognizable as fragments of a greater language, just as fragments are part of a vessel. And I think that's what John just spoke about in terms of bringing forward the language of the commenter and bringing it back to us today. There are just an incredible number of fascinating things in the volume. John and David just spoke about, and particularly say some of the political concepts that remain important. But the terrain of debate in trying to interrogate, as John just spoke about the mapping of what constitutes a workers' government and the different dimensions of it, and trying to think about the complexity of that, the debate about national self-determination and colonialism, the beginnings of what has been a century-long debate about understanding hegemony, is very, very rich in this volume, and kind of speaks, I thought, to a range of things that aren't either in Perry Anderson's famous antinomies of Antonio Gramsci or in Peter Thomas's book on the Gramscian moment. There's a dimension here in rethinking of the Comintern and the strategy that I think is raised. That's something that's missing in them. You can almost open any page and find something interesting. I found partly for current political and theoretical issues, the beginning of the discussion of Bukharin on the program of the International and the Communist Party is quite fascinating for its revelations about some of the what have to be interpreted as very positivistic tendencies about the law of immiseration crisis, the nature of the state. But I think there are also really fascinating discussions about yes, there it is, about the nature of the Soviet economy or socialist economies. He's writing, of course, in the context of the new economic policy, and this is also a language. It's a bit surprising that it also speaks to theoretical debates today. Bukharin's speech notes, now another point that relates to what I've just discussed, the question of the national varieties of socialism, referring, of course, to the productive relations. And he goes on, we see varying paths, varying characteristics over the time, of course. The growth of the world economy evens out those differences. In other words, the specific characteristics of capitalism in each country will find expression in specific forms of socialist productive economy. Later on, all this will even out the growth of the proletarian world supremacy and so on and so on. But he's talking about and then he goes on, the first stage of development, even after the proletariat has conquered political power in every country, will feature varying forms of socialist production. You know, an issue that remains important to the current debate about the new theory of the transition to socialism. I think there are also a lot of things in the proceedings and from John's preface that related to present debate. One of the fascinating things is Lenin's intervention in the Comintern, where he's particularly defending and elaborating about the new economic policy. And he speaks particularly to the difficulty they've had in reconstructing the Soviet state and the walking away of all the personnel and the Bolshevik government having to beg them to come back. And then the difficulty of trying to then educate and the throwing forward of hoping that educated new cadre will be able to take over that state. And of course, we know the disaster that occurred about the kind of cadre who came to take over that state. And I think this remains, you know, one of the essential theoretical problems of developing alternatives. Lenin's other famous comment on this, of course, is that he said defeating the bourgeoisie was the easiest task. The difficult task will be the task of administration, meaning how do we start developing actual forms of self-government, self-administration that push forward to systematic paths of democratization. There is a second dimension, I think, that one also is raised in terms of the book that's not there at all. That's important for us today, and that's, of course, the question of eco-socialism. There's not one mention of nature, ecology, those kinds of questions. But the way the debate is occurring, it forces us to try to rethink all those concepts in relationship to that fundamental question. John spoke about a third thing that I want to raise, that I think is a tension in the text, in the proceedings, and is not really worked out. And that is, of course, we have to draw a distinction between this period and the third period after 1928, and even the reaction and resistance that came from, say, the Italian communists, Bordaga and Gramsci in the initial period of the Comintern, the resistance to the United Front. And that is the tension that remains of the 21 conditions and the movement to the banning of factions and the moving towards a particular type of democratic centralist organizational structure that isn't worked out. Many of those things remain a problem today in many parties that are in this tradition in relationship to accommodation towards feminism and ecology. So I think there are some tensions there that are in the proceedings that are raised, and I think are really an important aspect of today's debate. John's reading of this is, of course, and particularly in his preface, is an amazing preface to the Congress, and it's his emphasis on the variety of tactics that Lenin deployed both before and after 1917, and it's an insistence that he's getting across about the organizational experimentation that was part of Lenin's politics, and which is, I think, a challenge today. Just to wrap up, you know, when John began this project and sought out help from the university to get access to various things, not being part of the Marxist-Leninist tradition, I thought it was an aspect of you know, the looking for the algebra of revolution, and it's part of the debate about trying to find the one true Leninism. But what's remarkable about this volume is exactly what John got forward in his introduction. The finding of many forms of Leninism, the finding of many forms of politics, and it's a volume then that doesn't just speak to the past, but is in fact part of our politics for the future. Thank you. Congratulations.